Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas, current member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but that's all going to be changing next year because I have officially announced my retirement on the House floor. However, I have found an excellent person to replace me. Her name is Karen Hamilton. Go to hamiltonforvirginia.com and go check out. Karen's great. Karen's great.
She's going to need help to get over the line, though.
Yeah, but you can do it. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone. I am not Queen of the Bees anymore.
The Bees?
My bees absconded, so I am not. And I was called something last episode that I feel like I want as my moniker. Somebody said that sandwich maker needs to, shut up, shut her mouth. And I thought, oh my gosh, sandwich maker. Can you introduce me as sandwich maker from now on, honey?
I can see that going real well. I can see that going. You do make delicious sandwiches, I will say. And with us in the studio, having completed a full year of his 30s, Christian Hines, the Oracle of Virginia, the resident historian, the political prognosticator, and one more year in to be taken seriously, because that's what happens in your 30s. Nobody takes you seriously in your 20s. That's right. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen. We have replaced him with a balloon.
I just want to point out, Nick and Tina were the ones that kind of made me do the cheesy thing of holding the balloon up.
We absolutely
in front of
made
the camera.
you do that.
I did not want to do that, but they told me I had to.
Yep.
No, it was good. Yeah, Tina comes in, and all of his gifts this year were basically rooted around making him warmer because
he's always cold.
I'm always freezing in
we
the
always
studio.
have heating issues in the studio, and Christian's always freezing, so he's got like flannels and heating pads, and then Tina got him a chocolate cake he hates.
He's like, oh, you got me a chocolate cake.
Yeah,
Is this a good time to tell you I hate chocolate cake?
I don't know if the camera can catch this.
Pick it
but
up. Show
Tina,
him how cute it is.
Let's see.
Pretty much the only thing they had at the store that looked decent.
Yeah.
Yeah, here it is.
Well, you didn't make it from scratch, baby?
No, I didn't.
It's a sandwich
I wish I
maker,
would've.
not cake maker.
Yeah,
It
she
didn't say
brings
I was
this
a
in
cake
here.
maker.
She brings this in here, and I'm like, oh, thank you, Tina, but is this the part where I have to tell you that I don't like chocolate cake?
I'm concerned
just
about
shut up and
anybody
eat it.
that doesn't like chocolate. I'm sorry.
It's a little bit scary.
So we don't have an outline for today's podcast, in large part because when we were recording our previous show, right after that, we were having a discussion about what today's episode was going to be about.
Yeah.
And it just so happened to fall on my birthday.
Yeah.
And so Nick was like, well, Christian, why don't we just do something that you want to talk about? So I was like, okay, let me come up with a list of a few things. Let me write some stuff down. And eventually it just hit me. And I'm like, I'm so indecisive that I decided, let's just have an open discussion in general. Let's just have a conversation like the type that we normally have. Because what happens, and the audience doesn't know this, but like what happens is we'll sit here and we'll talk for like 10, 15 minutes before the cameras start rolling. And then depending on the day and depending on what else needs to get done, we'll also sit here and talk for another 10, 15, 30, 40, sometimes an hour after the cameras are off. And I find quite often that the type of conversations that we have when the cameras aren't rolling, in some ways, are my favorite conversations.
Yeah.
Like we just...
Well, we started on one where we were, because obviously there's a lot of conversation going on right now between Trump's tariffs, the left. I was just sitting all day listening to Democrats talk about how we needed all these government subsidies and government programs and minimum wages and interventions into the economy. And it was amazing because I'm increasingly watching people from all sides of the political spectrum offer up solutions for things. And I feel like, I mean, look, I don't mean this arrogantly, but I feel like some people have spent absolutely zero time understanding economic principles or economic reality, and instead want to feel like they can overcome reality with a sense of compassion or patriotism, when in reality, if you really want to be both compassionate and patriotic, you need to understand how reality works to include economic reality, because it's the only you're not going to subvert it, right? You're not going to patriot or compassion your way around reality. You have to understand reality and then work within it in order to achieve the sort of objectives that will help people. And so we started on this conversation. You actually brought up the Candlein effect, which
Hold on, before you get into all of that, there's a really important question from the audience, from Connor.
Yeah.
Question: what cake type does Christian like?
Oh,
that's a good question. I like strawberry, vanilla, lemon.
Ooh, lemon, yeah.
Velvet can be good.
What kind of velvet?
Just
Oh
you know,
my
velvet
gosh!
cake.
Don't
velvet
you
just a
don't you
cake in and
know
of
that a
itself?
red velvet
Yeah.
cake is actually a chocolate cake just with red food
It's-
dye?
No, it does not. It does not
It
taste the
is,
same.
though.
It does not taste.
But it is though.
I can certainly taste the
But
food dye.
the difference is that it's got a cream cheese frosting.
RFK
instead
would
of
be so
chocolate
mad at
frosting.
you right now.
But no, I mean mostly like probably like strawberry, vanilla, lemon, stuff like that. I don't know. It's not that I don't like chocolate. It's that I just don't like chocolate cake for some reason. But
yeah.
no, I
Bring this man a lemon cake.
yeah.
so enough about cakes and
Yeah.
and
Okay, when Nick was saying we can't, bend around reality and the whole deal, I thought for sure you were gearing that up for a segue
No.
about other things that can conceal the realities.
oh
She's
she just tried to tee up an
trying
ad
to
right
force
there.
a segue, and I'm not going to do it
I
now.
thought he
no,
could
I'm not
do-
going to
okay,
do it.
fine.
Nope. You don't get to force the segue on me.
Instead,
right.
this episode was brought to you by Gold Bars.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
this
yeah, freedom
sandwich
water.
maker is hereby shutting her mouth.
Okay, so what's going on? I really liked it because I don't have any outline.
Well, what we were talking about before is like what is the so obviously there's people on the left and the right that are both identifying problems within our economy, and the question is that
Nobody
And-
knows
and-
what's really going on.
and not only that, but it's not just the economic, right? Because the economic impacts the social and the cultural in very, very significant ways. And what are the best ways that you address that? And I think one of the best ways that you address that is through True Classic. Because if you want to support a good American company making a great product, then that is True Classic. Because ultimately, good economics means people within the free market using their time, talents, and resources in order to make products and services that consumers want to voluntarily purchase. And I will tell you right now, I voluntarily purchase a lot of True Classic, to include this stylish long sleeve shirt that I'm wearing today. I don't always
Look at
go
those
with
guns in
I
that
don't,
shirt.
Thank you, baby. And you know what? You know why these guns actually exist? Because of True Classic. It's actually a True Classic filter. No, but I will say that I like I said before, I was introduced to True Classic from their T-shirts because I am a casual kind of guy. But I have been really pleasantly surprised, not just by their more casual wear, but some of their more formal wear as well.
So if you want your arms to look like Nick's,
Oh my gosh!
get some.
Thank you,
True
baby.
Classic.
Thank you. Actually, no, you get True Classic, and you get a lady that tells you how good you look, even when it might not be true. So. TrueClassic.com/Nick. Go over there and check out the bundles. Again, the gateway drug is the T-shirts. I'm going to tell you this right now. The gateway drug is the T-shirts with True Classic. But again, their long sleeves, their pants, their fitness gear is awesome. Love their stuff for the gym. And I can't emphasize that enough. I really think one of the things that I think discourages people when they first start getting back into the gym and working on stuff like that is if you're wearing a crappy old T-shirt that just makes you feel weak, it doesn't actually work. You wear something that fits you the way it should, and you go out there and work out. I'm just saying right now, it makes you feel better. And when you feel better, you're doing the things that make you feel better. So TrueClassic.com/Nick. Check out the bundles. I'm telling you, check out the bundles. Anyway, talking about the economy.
Yeah, so I don't want this to just be about the economy.
No.
I'd like this to be a broader conversation about like just to be honest with you, like what the hell has happened?
Yeah.
I mean, we can start on the economy if you want, because that's actually been in the news. And I think, we're early enough in the episode that a lot of people are probably hearing things about like tariffs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, I had somebody ask me, I'll actually just read this off because I ended up, I don't have any links. This isn't going to be brought up, but I had somebody ask me my thoughts on the whole tariff situation. And so I ended up writing it as a tweet. And again, I don't have it on screen because we don't have any links in today's episode. But a few people asked me about Trump's tariffs. So here's what I said. I said, you can't just slap tariffs on a broken system and expect it to start working again. Manufacturing isn't coming back to the U.S. in any meaningful way until we confront the one thing no one wants to talk about, which is the dollar.
Yeah.
And the thing that I actually incorporated in that tweet was a screenshot of a portion of Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, that she wrote 2 years ago. And I actually want to read that because Lynn Alden is far more intelligent than I am on this. She says this: the cost of the Eurodollar/petrodollar system from 1974 to present is that by having so many entities around the world hold dollar-denominated assets for lack of a better alternative, it artificially increases the purchasing power of the US dollar. The extra monetary premium reduces the United States' export competitiveness and gradually hollows out the United States' industrial base. To supply the world with the dollars it needs, the United States runs a persistent trade deficit. The very power granted to the reserve currency issuer is also what, over the course of decades, begins to poison it and render it unfit to maintain its status.
Mm-hmm.
So she kind of uncovered something that is, I think this is called the Tilfin dilemma, that was first uncovered in the 1960s, that basically whoever is the reserve currency has to run a trade deficit. And I don't think that the Tilfin dilemma really got into this, but actually the logical conclusion is not just it has to run a trade deficit, it actually has to run a budget deficit too. Because one of the things that we're doing is we have basically exported our industrial base to the rest of the world in order to export dollars to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world needs dollars in order to trade.
Okay, real quick, when people, so when I hear that though, it's like we had to do this in order to do this. I don't know that
we had to do this in order to maintain the Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods 2, which is post 1971.
But here's what I'm saying: like I don't know that I buy the idea that what we said was okay. We're going to deliberately export our manufacturing to the other side of the world. I think.
No, this is organic. This isn't like conspiratorial.
Again, it's not a centrally planned decision to where we're going to move all the plants overseas. What it is we created a natural incentive through monetary manipulation
for this to happen.
We created a natural incentive for this to take place.
And this carries huge second and third and arguably fourth order effects if you think about it, because like in the 1950s, the US is this manufacturing powerhouse. It's, I think like right after World War II, there was a brief period where it was like literally 50% of the entire world's GDP.
Yeah.
And because Europe had bombed itself into oblivion, there weren't really any factories left standing in Europe. And so from a manufacturing perspective, the United States was like absolutely without question the global economic superpower.
Well, and can we say a couple things about that?
Look at it today.
Well, I think we need to tee this up a little bit, right? Earlier when you first see the Industrial Revolution, you see that first manifesting itself in the UK. And okay, so why the UK? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, the UK had fairly good system for property rights. It had a fairly open system for being able to engage in market forces. There was other things too that actually worked against that. You had an aristocratic system. You had some other things that pushed. You had kind of this. Initially, you had this idea of looking down on people that were involved in trade. But you still had a system where people could accumulate wealth. If you respected property rights, what ended up happening over time was that a lot of the landed gentry ended up losing their kind of privileged place economically within society as the people that were coming up through the trades. And
new money crowded out old money.
Exactly. Because in that system, you still allowed for people to be able to attain wealth. It wasn't automatically confiscated from them by the landed aristocracy or by the government or whatever else it was, like it was in other places around the world. And so as much as people want to look back now at this kind of Dickens view of the Industrial Revolution of, oh, how it was so cruel and the aristocratic. Okay, and yet compared to the rest of the world at that time, nobody in the world provided for the degree of upward economic mobility that England did. Now, you also started to see a large industrial base coming out of places like Germany. And so what was interesting is that those countries which did allow for fairly strong property rights and upward economic mobility, combined with a culture that allowed for things like freedom of inquiry and the ability to test and the ability to and investment.
Yeah, I was about to ask, like, where are you going with this, Nick?
Well, I'm saying that this is important things to understand about how these things developed and where they developed. Because
so how did they fly off the rails? Because like during the Industrial Revolution, depending on like when you want to date it, right? It starts like in the late 18th, early 19th century, the first Industrial Revolution. A lot of people point to 1871 as like the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but in many ways that's like the second. That's like the second Industrial Revolution is the Franco-Prussian War. And the second Industrial Revolution is when the UK loses its global edge, right?
Yeah.
It kind of becomes a contest between the German Empire and the United States until World War I ends with Germany's defeat, and then the United States is like firmly established as the
that's, I mean, you have two major world wars that hit Europe and do an amazing amount of devastation. However, it's important to understand that even though Germany was like in many cases economically devastated after World War I, it's amazing how quickly they were able to recover their industrial base and things of that nature. But following World War II,
there's nothing left.
Following World War II, every single major industrial power had essentially been just taken through the ringer, except for the United States. And the reason why I brought up all of those conditions about property rights, freedom of inquiry, the ability to invest, upward economic mobility, is because all of those are necessary conditions to essentially be able to take advantage of essentially a huge decline in competition. So the United States comes out of World War II with an environment where we essentially have this incredibly strong industrial base, a lot of natural resources, a lot of people that essentially want to trade with us or need our consumer goods and everything else. And it creates a perfect storm for us to be able to take advantage of those conditions in order to become just economically dominant. But within a relatively short period of time, what we also see is the countries which also adopted similar policies, property rights, et cetera, they recover fairly quickly. And the countries which push back against it don't. It's actually one of the reasons why, if you look at post-World War II, Germany recovered faster than the UK, even though Germany had been essentially decimated. And people try to chalk that up to the Marshall Plan. That does not explain why Germany overtook the UK economically in a relatively short period of time.
Well, another reason is because there's nothing left standing. Mm-hmm. And so it's, in some ways, it's easier to build on an empty lot than on an occupied lot. Like this is kind of why Germany industrialized much faster than the UK. The UK industrialized earlier, but Germany overtook the UK before World War I as kind of the manufacturing powerhouse in Europe because, well, Germany was starting from scratch in a way, right? Germany was starting from an agrarian society in the 1860s and 1870s. There wasn't as much industry as there was in the UK. The UK had industry going back to the late 1700s. Mm-hmm. And so because they're starting from nothing, they can build up very quickly. Like you get the same thing in China, right? Like think about after Mao's death, like China industrializes very quickly and becomes the, what do they call it? The work, the workshop of the world, right? In the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Well, it's because they're basically coming right out of a peasant society in one generation, right? They go from basically being a peasant society to being not quite a first world nation, but certainly like an industrialized nation. Well, like there's stories of Red Guard members going around. I remember there's this story that I read once of a bunch of Red Guards going around. This is like in the height of the like cultural revolution, right? They're going around like in rural China. These are like ideologically possessed people trying to spread the name of the revolution. And like to their stun, like they're shocked when they go into this rural village and they're talking to some elderly people in the village. And one of the village elders goes up to these, like teenagers that are indoctrinated into Marxism. And they're like, tell me, who sits on the dragon throne these days?
Yeah.
and they're sitting there like, What? You haven't gotten the news of the last like 25 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's just funny how like, it reminds me of like a similar story of like, what was it? Like 1912. There's these like islands in the Aegean. This is during the Balkan Wars. There's these islands in the Aegean that are like finally being unified with Greece because the Ottoman Empire is disintegrating in Europe. They're being attacked on all sides. The Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Greeks, they're all coming in and grabbing the Balkans for themselves, and then eventually they end up fighting each other for the spoils. But one of the things that the Greeks discovered is they take these islands that they're like, this is rightful Greek territory, but we haven't had contact with them in hundreds of years. And they show up and they're expecting to like talk to people, treating them as liberators, right? Welcoming them back as Greeks. And they show up and these troops on this ship jump off on the island and they're like, where's the welcoming party? And they find like some local fishing village and they're like, we're here to liberate you. Why aren't you here to celebrate us? We're liberating you as fellow Greeks. And these like school kids, these are like 10-year-old kids. Like one girl goes up to them and they're like, we're not Greeks.
We're Romans.
We're Romans.
Yeah. It's crazy to not to get too off on topic on that one, but yeah, it is. Obviously, if you were born and raised in the 20th or 21st century, you have this idea of, oh yeah, Greece. There was no Greek identity in the way that we think of it.
They spoke Greek as a language, but culturally they viewed themselves
as
Romans, which is, I mean, you think about how many hundreds of years it had been since Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans.
Well, we figure even whenever we're talking about the Greek city-state. So let's look at, I mean, you look at the fall of Greece that took place during the early Roman Republic, is when Rome actually had conquered and essentially, adopted a lot of Greek culture and philosophy and whatnot, but was predominant. And then the Byzantine Empire. So it was Roman dominance of what we would call Greece from like the 300s BC to
the Macedonian Wars
BC,
it was like 180, something like that.
Yeah. So late 100 BC, all the way until the fall of Constantinople, and then it was an Ottoman possession all the way until
1912
after World War I. And so yeah, it was like kind of rekindling this idea of Greek culture and drawing the lineage more back to the Greek city-states as opposed to Roman or Byzantine culture was.
So I'm actually going somewhere with this, believe it or not. When you have a non-globalized system, right, when people are kind of isolated from, what's going on the other side of the world, you can retain an identity like that. You can kind of be shielded from the rest of the world, like in the case of those rural farmers in China, not even knowing that their own government had been taken over by communists 20 years ago, or these Greek islanders who didn't view themselves as Greeks, they viewed themselves as Romans, despite the fact that the Byzantine Empire had fallen something like 400 years earlier.
Yeah.
But when you get into like a modern financialized globalized system like the one that we've really established after World War II. This is one of many elements of what they call the post-war order. It's really hard to kind of insulate yourself from that. You cannot, like today, you cannot get a situation where some school children on an island in the Aegean are calling themselves Romans.
Yeah.
I mean, you're getting to a point where people within a country don't even identify within that country. This goes back to the conversation that you missed the first half of from a week ago, where we were talking about Christopher Lash's Revolt of the Elites.
Yeah. You
have a huge chunk of the population that quite frankly, they don't even view themselves as Americans. They view themselves as global citizens.
Yeah. Citizen of the world.
And a huge consequence of that is the type of system that we set up after World War II. We deconstructed nationalism.
Yeah.
Because we're like, well, nationalism gave us 2 world wars within a single lifetime, within a single generation. So that needs to go, right? We can't have borders are bad, and so we need a globalized system, because in some ways they
didn't completely get rid of borders.
No, but think about Europe. Think about the European Union, right? They're coming up with these systems to basically how do we create a system where Belgium is not being invaded every 20 years?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and can we also
we integrate Belgium into a continental wide system where you can cross the people, and it's actually in some ways a manifestation of Frederick Bastiat's argument that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Well, the EU in some ways is an attempt to say, well, let's have people cross borders, not soldiers. People will still cross, but they're not going to be armed.
Yeah.
And goods are going to cross rather than armies.
Yeah.
And we're going to deconstruct nationalism, and we're going to create a globalized marketplace.
Well, can we also say this? If you just lived through 2 world wars.
I'm trying to be generous with the system, actually.
No, I think
because I'm about to be ruthless with the system later.
I do think we're a little bit too harsh to the. I think it's natural for new generations to be harsh to the ones that came before them, in part because they're not living. They're living.
They're seeing the consequences of the system.
Well, and yes,
there's a reason it's Chesterton's fence, right? Look.
Wait a second. It's the idea that systems are generally created in order to deal with the problems of the time. When the systems do a good job of addressing some of those problems, right, it becomes very, very easy several decades later to wonder why those systems were put in place, or look at all the problems caused by this current system. And it's always, again, to your point about the fence, right? It's always a good question to ask first and foremost, why was the fence constructed in the first place before you go ripping it up? Because sometimes you find that the fence needs to be ripped up. Sometimes you find that the fence needs to be modified. Sometimes you find that the fence was put there in the first place for a very bad reason. But you have to contend with the question of why the fence is there. And if you look at why, first of all, wars had stretched across Europe forever, right? Forever. And we had different approaches. The Peace of Westphalia is a great example of Europe trying to come to some sort of arrangement on what happens within your borders, what happens within my borders, and we don't get involved in wars over religion and things of that nature. And the post-World War II era was in direct response to what was perceived as the root causes of two of the most disastrous world wars in history, combined with two major competing ideologies and the advent of atomic weapons. So we were genuinely and if you are a diplomat, if you are a senior ranking political official, you are honestly coming to grips in 1945 and 1946 with the idea that the United States, through industrialization, through technological advancement, now holds in its hands the genuine ability to destroy humanity in a way that has just never existed before. There was always, acts of God, the bubonic plague, something like that, an ice age, but never something where you could load something onto a plane, drop it, and kill 100,000 people in one foul swoop. So that had to be a terrifying proposition when the same 50-year-old diplomat or politician that's now grown up in two world wars and has now seen what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki is thinking to themselves, when I was a kid, I remember seeing a car for the first time, right? Like, please understand, my grandmother was born on Christmas Day, 1900. She remembers her dad trading with Indians in New Mexico. And by the time she's 70, somebody's walking on the moon, right?
A lot happened.
That is a lot. A person farming in 19th century England would if you took someone from ancient Egypt and you brought them to 19th century, or we'll say 17th century England, they would be impressed by certain things, but they would understand all the farming tools. They would understand kind of the basic mechanics of a lot of the day-to-day, mechanisms for building. They would get it. It would be wow, that's really neat and new, but it wouldn't be, oh my gosh, how does that work? Well, that same person,
if they saw it today, they think it's magic.
Oh my gosh, and so when we can at least put ourselves in that position and just feel maybe a little bit of empathy for people that are like, no, this is going to get really, really bad, really, really quick.
No, I get it. There's a reason that the post-war order exists in the first place. I just think that it's not fit for purpose anymore. And I'm not the only one. There was a statement from a senior White House official. We didn't know the name. We might get it in the future. I'm willing to bet it's actually Stephen Miller.
I was going to say, I bet it's Stephen Miller.
It's probably Stephen Miller. And I see a lot of people that are like pointing out the irony that a Jewish guy is criticizing the post-war order. Yeah. But like, he's right. If it's Stephen Miller, and I'm willing to bet it's Stephen Miller. Yeah. And he, assuming it's him, even if it's not him, somebody in the White House, like literally it was like yesterday, put out a statement to the press and was like, they literally said, like verbatim, the post-World War II international order and institutions are no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah.
Now, I'm tweaking a couple of the language, but they literally said, like, the post-World War II system is no longer suitable for the current political and economic system that we have today, order that we have today. Mm-hmm. It needs to go. Like, that is shocking if you think about it, because it's like the U.S. built that system.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we were the ones that led the charge in setting up the United Nations. We were the ones that encouraged, we didn't set it up, right? The European powers did, but we encouraged the European Union. Yeah. We certainly played a huge role, majority role in setting up Bretton Woods.
Yeah.
In part because some other powers didn't like it, like the French didn't like it. But, it was like, well, tough luck. We had literally just liberated them from the Nazis about like a month earlier from when Bretton Woods had taken place. Bretton Woods took place in late 1944. The war was still going on when Bretton Woods took place. Like, we built that system, and then we arrayed that system against the Soviets, right? It was this ideological clash, good and evil, capitalism versus Marxism, democracy versus dictatorship, and we win the Cold War. And so the post-war order in some ways becomes the post-Cold War order.
Yeah.
Going into the 1990s, and it's this era of good feelings in the 1990s, and we think like, oh, it's the end of history, right? It's Francis Fukuyama's book.
Yeah.
Liberalism is triumphed.
We figured it all out.
And it turns out, no, it's not the end of history. And it also turns out that, no, liberalism's not the final end state. And also, there's a lot of bad things that come out of liberalism. It turns into this comprehensive thing that dissolves the necessary bonds for civilization. And so then you get the populist backlash of the 2010s and 2020s.
Well, I think
and now people are questioning the whole thing, and they're rightfully questioning it because we don't live in 1946 anymore.
Well, I think there's something to be said too, where the good systems, and this is something that in some ways, in some ways has described the United States, certainly not perfectly and certainly not always, but good systems are generally, actually, I'll tell you one that it has actually probably done if you want to look at a system which overall, while remaining some level of consistency, that has navigated history very, very well, is actually the UK. Some people will say China. China certainly has. I mean, you have to be impressed with something of a coherent cultural tie going back to antiquity to today. But
they have a history of breaking themselves and piecing themselves back together.
Yeah, you also have to acknowledge, well, and a lot of foreign conquest as well, where China ends up conquering their conquerors, right? Like the Mongols and Manchus and whatnot. But in the UK, if you want to look at a country that once it did finally become kind of the semblance of what we think of like England, in 1066 with Norman the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings, and you have something of an unbroken chain of independence and being able to navigate world history and incredible developments while maintaining a cultural consistency, a unifying history and narrative and religion and all of these things. And it's only now actually that it's really starting to fall apart. It's starting to unravel, not in the midst of war, but in the midst of
peace.
Yeah. But all that to say that a marker of a good system is one that can set up foundational institutions which are capable of adapting to situations as they occur throughout time. Whereas it almost feels like right now we are all like, we're rigidly trying to hold on to something, and we're saying that it's bad, when in reality, I think probably a fairer explanation is to say it was appropriate. There were elements of this that were very appropriate, understandable, and even arguably necessary for a particular moment in history. You could say several decades, several generations. But now it has to adapt, because if it doesn't, it's going to break. If it's so rigid.
The reason that there's so many people that are clinging on to it is because they think, I disagree with it, but they think with good reason. Mm-hmm. Good reason nowadays is increasingly not becoming good, but they sincerely believe that the alternative, the pre-war order, right,
yeah,
was horrible from their perspective. And so they're like, this system, broadly speaking, globalization, liberalism as almost a crusading ideology that has to spread itself everywhere. Yeah. Internationalization, make the world safe for democracy. All of these things, the United Nations, all the NGOs, international organizations, all these things are necessary because the alternative is panzers rolling into Danzig or nukes flying to Moscow, and Moscow nukes flying to Washington. Right? It's either globalization, liberalization, and then the final end result actually being wokeism, which maybe we'll get to. It's either that or World War III, right? And totalizing ideologies. And ultimately, that's actually just not true. What this is trying to do is create a false dichotomy in order to justify its own existence. And it's in part because the people that are running the system, the managerial class that are in charge of the system, they have to come up with the justification for why they're in charge of everything.
Well, Loyal to Law asked a really good question. He goes, how could we know if a system that was appropriate for the day should be abolished or dissolved, since it's not needed anymore, and its time of usage is past? So what is the best way?
I'd say that the best way for us to identify that is when they started mutilating children.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they
Transgender,
opened
you
up the
know,
borders, imported 20 million illegal immigrants, many of whom don't want to assimilate and are just economic migrants, and they started mutilating children, and they told us that this is progress.
Yeah.
I would say at that point we should have started questioning the system.
Well, okay, but I get it. I'm not disagreeing with that. But I think it's a good question. It's the idea of something has been put in place in order to prevent something or to foster something. And again, it's the old question of, you're tearing down the fence or you're significantly modifying the fence. So how do you know when it is time, when it is legitimately time to modify the fence, as opposed to ripping it up too closely, and now all of a sudden you do have German tanks rolling through again, right? Like, one of the questions that's being asked right now, and it's a fair critique, right? Because the United States is essentially telling Europe, take care of your own problems. And there's some people, and we brought this up, that are looking back at the United States going, you didn't want us taking care of our own problems, because when we tried to do that, we constantly went to war with each other for 8 centuries.
Yeah, but now we do want them to take care of it. The situation has changed. Japan's not our enemy anymore, right? We want Japan to rearm.
No, okay. Don't give me a response right away, because what the real question here is not, okay, how do we respond to Europe in that? The real question is that, yes, the United States got concerned about what became our European allies as a bulwark against the communists. Before they had the communists, they were constantly killing each other. And so now we're trying to create some sort of stability. How do we do that? Well, one of the answers to that was U.S. economic and military hegemony. And what that has resulted in is something that is very, very costly to the United States, and something that our own citizenry has gotten tired of, in part because that hegemony led to a lot of foreign interventions that we're just done with now. Now, to Loyal to Law's question, they say, okay, great. We understand why Americans are tired, but if you do this, what is the probability that the old world order, that the orders that we have set up in order to prevent some of the things that were happening before, how do we know that those things don't happen again when we leave the United Nations, or we leave, Brent Woods, or
So there's a book called Return of the Strong Gods that R.R. Reno wrote maybe 5 or 6 years ago, right before COVID. It was like 2018, 2019. And he talks about this a little bit. He says that there's these forces, he calls them the strong gods, right? Nationalism, populism, religion, kinship ties. It's this idea of community, right? And it's not just that, but it's basically built around identity. Who are you as a person? Because you're not just a economic unit, right?
Yeah.
You're not a number on a spreadsheet. You're a particular human being that exists and belongs to a particular time and place. If you plopped me in ancient Rome, I wouldn't fit in, because I don't speak the language, I don't practice their religion, I don't share their culture.
The cultural norms don't make sense.
I'd be a total alien. I'd be like from a foreign planet.
Offended.
I belong to a particular time and place. I belong to, 21st century America.
Yeah.
I have a German last name, but I'm not German. I'm American.
Yeah.
And ethnically, like, if you test my DNA, more of my DNA comes from the Italian peninsula than anywhere else. I'm more ethnically Italian than anything, but I'm not Italian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually going to Italy in June. I don't speak the language. I don't have the culture.
Yeah.
I don't belong there. I belong here. This is my home. And there's nowhere else in the world for me. But the problem is, one of many problems of the post-war order is, it actually dissolved all of those type of bonds that root you to a particular place in time. You are no longer an American, you're a global citizen. You're no longer X, Y, or Z, any identity, because those identities have to be dissolved, because those identities are actually the things that give birth to conflict.
Yeah.
And so it's the idea that nationalism, patriotism, religion, ethnicity, all of these things are what fuels genocide. They fuel wars of religion. They fuel conflict. They fuel world wars. And so the logic that the individuals that created the post-war order came up with is, these things need to take a back seat, because we blew ourselves up twice in a 20-year period because of them. And we're going to replace them with a globalized system that discourages these things and encourages peace. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it. But the problem is, you're actually in some ways stealing people's meaning away from them, because men don't exist to maximize GDP. We exist to form bonds with people that are close to us. We exist to form families, to form communities. These things are organically created. the whole reason that nationalism exists in the first place, the German nation as a concept, the French nation as a concept, exists is because tribes came together and formed an identity over a long enough period of time. Those are actually good things. They provide a foundation for meaning and purpose. It's community that creates governments over time, that creates societies over time. And if you dissolve those things, what you're actually replacing it with over a long enough period of time is a crisis of meaning. You're replacing it with nihilism.
I think it's if I could pick a song that is the motto of kind of like this modern progressive approach to society, it's Imagine by John Lennon.
I was going to say it's Imagine by John Lennon.
It's Imagine by John Lennon. I think it would not be too strong a word to say that I utterly despise that song, because it carries with it this incredibly.
It's the worst song ever written.
I don't think you're wrong.
Like it is literally the song of the progressive managerial class.
It is like
it's the Democratic Party's anthem.
I'm gonna read the lyrics for you right now because and here's why it's so pernicious. It's because on some level it sounds superficially good. Not all of it, but on some level, like when you look, it's got this very, very nice veneer.
It's got a great melody. It's got a great melody, but the lyrics are awful.
Here's the lyrics. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one.
That's like the post-war boomer anthem. That is the most boomer-esque.
Well, here's the part. Here's the part where
liberal.
I mean, there's many things
ever.
you can look at this, like the whole no heaven, no hell, no. It's if you look at this.
No countries, no possessions.
No countries,
it's the WEF's agenda.
Yeah, it's Marx. It's a Marxist anthem. It really is a Marxist anthem. But here's the part that I think is important, and this goes right to what you said: is nothing to kill or die for.
That also means there's nothing to live for.
There's nothing to live for. There's no meaning. There's no purpose. Because if there's nothing to kill or nothing to die for, now again, I get it. I would love it to where we have a world where we're not killing each other. Like I don't want that. That's the part. That's what makes the song pernicious, right? Like. Nothing to kill for or nothing to die for. Well, obviously we want to live in a world where we don't have to kill each other in order to live. But the idea that there's nothing to die for, what a shabby existence. The idea that there is absolutely nothing. And why wouldn't you die for anything? Because after all, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no God, there's no objective morality, there's no objective truth. There's none of it.
Even the nothing to die for portion is also bad, because if you don't
No, that's what I'm saying. Nothing to die for.
To kill for. The idea that there is nothing you care about so much that you wouldn't let it go in lieu of killing for it.
So which
means you wouldn't kill for your children. You know, you wouldn't kill for your loved ones.
You guys are gonna get mad at me at first. Maybe mad. But if you actually listen to the end, and this isn't written by me, this was actually written by somebody that follows me. It carries a lot of implications for what you were just bringing up with Lennon's song, because Lennon's song and Imagine is the WEF's anthem. It's the Democratic Party's anthem. It's the anthem of post-war liberal, not conservative, liberal boomers who. Just free love, man.
Yeah.
You know, it's the it's the anthem of Woodstock, right?
Yeah.
When you think about the generation that came out of World War II, that were born after it, they grew up in this like era of peace and prosperity, that decided, well, we're going to destroy national identity. We're going to destroy community. We're going to destroy traditions.
Yeah.
We're going to dismantle everything and just self-actualization all the way, right? Like, we're just going to, pursue comprehensive liberalism.
Yeah.
And I'm divorcing that from classical John Lockean liberalism. Comprehensive liberalism is like, it's the idea that you must be freed of any restraints and society must pay for you to be freed of any
responsibilities.
responsibilities. This is modern day progressivism,
Yes.
right? Like that song is the embodiment of that mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually really missing the point. And the point was actually articulated by the gentleman that wrote Concept of the Political. Now he's a hypocrite, right? Because he doesn't follow through on it.
Yeah.
This is left out. I mean, Strauss caught on to this, right? But it's left out because Schmidt made some terrible life choices.
Yeah.
After he wrote this book, right?
Yeah.
Almost immediately after he wrote this book. But he's correct, like with his concept of, and this is left out because everybody focuses on the friend enemy distinction and stuff like that. But some of his other broader points that are important is like the total state.
Yeah.
And I had a follower that actually wrote a very detailed explanation of the process that's, I think, articulates the point that he tried and in many respects kind of failed to fully articulate, because he's not the best moral standard bearer of this, in part because, well, he threw his weight behind a regime that really embodied the total state, if you think about it, right? Yeah. This person a few days ago actually tweeted back at me because I quoted a paragraph from the Concept of the Political talking about the total state. And I was like, this is what happens when politics seeps into everything.
Yeah.
And you get a mixture of culture and society and politics, and suddenly everything becomes political. Like this is how your local knitting club is talking about pronouns and transgenderism.
Yeah.
Right? Like it spreads everywhere. And I had a follower that said, just to be clear, Schmidt's worry here has two directions. On one hand, liberalism tends to politicize and draw into the political sphere arenas of life which were previously apolitical. And specifically, he means that it transforms these spheres into an us versus them existential dispute that can't be left to private individuals to just decide for themselves. On the other hand, though, it reduces purely political disputes, and here he means matters of war and peace, security, and constitutional integrity, into not just an us versus them, which could be resolved any number of ways, like it was during the pre-Westphalian system. Like you sign a treaty divvying up land, but instead it has to become a battle between good and evil.
Yeah.
And so like when you think about the wars of German religion, the Treaty of Westphalia is not, you're existentially bad, I'm good, I'm fighting good versus evil, but it's like, let's just sit down like gentlemen, let's hash this out, let's draw the lines on the map, let's divvy up Europe, let's decide who gets what side of the river, and then let's live and let live.
Yeah.
That's what Schmidt is trying to say is real politics, like actual politics between enemies, because it doesn't have to be. Now, the wars of religion were existential in the fact that both sides thought that they were fighting for the correct interpretation of Christianity, but it wasn't, the Peace of Westphalia wasn't treated as an existential moral crusade. It was like, look, you control these parts of Europe, I control these parts. Let's strike a deal.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Trumpian, let's just strike a deal, man.
Yeah.
Let me stop demonizing your existence because I can't destroy you. You have enough political power to sustain yourself, and I do as well.
Yeah.
Let's hash this out like gentlemen, like adults.
Yeah.
But the current system we have today is, no, I will destroy you. The left is going out there saying, no, I won't tolerate anybody else existing. The left doesn't even grant the right, the moral legitimacy to exist at all, right? It's the whole, if we tried to come to them and say, let's back off, let's take 90% of everything out of DC and hand it back to the states, they would say no, because the trans youth of Mississippi must be liberated.
Yeah. And let's also face it, there's a compelling argument to be made when you look at certain aspects of it. So like, let me give you an example, abortion. Now, I think abortion is fundamentally evil, right? It's the deliberate destruction of innocent human life. And so the thing is that is it possible for me to ever really say, well, it's okay as long as you do it over there, right? The difference is that the moral categories for which I find it unacceptable to allow something to exist in a different place are very, very narrow for me. And they're incredibly broad for the liberal progressive, I think in part because they don't value borders, because they don't value those. I think this is your larger point here, is that now all of a sudden there's this endless necessity to advance the revolution wherever. And again, the closest I can come to that is that I believe it is, like, for instance, as a Christian, we have the Great Commission, right? It's the ideal to evangelize. But the big caveat in the Great Commission is that I cannot compel you by force to convert. And there is no such caveat that I can really see within the progressive mindset. as long as you use the process, you know, and again, in the United States, that's become the democratic process, but they've demonstrated everywhere else that they've pushed for a democratic process, that as soon as they get enough power, the democratic portion of that process goes away. They absolutely believe it's justified in order to attain the utopia that they've, you know, kind of elevated as heaven on earth, because it's morally justified. And therefore they will allow for some time for you to be convinced. But you'll notice it's a very, very narrow window throughout when we look at all of history. It's a very, very narrow window that you're allowed to be convinced, and then they start compelling you. They instantly start relying upon force to compel you to actually adopt this model, and eventually it always by necessity escalates. And it's because I think of what you just said. It's not that, hey, we disagree, live and let live. You do your thing over in your house, I'll do my thing in my house. And as long as we're not doing anything that falls into one of these truly egregious categories, like you're again, in the United States, right? If you look at kind of the concept that we were going for, it was, and this is kind of the libertarian philosophy, you do you, I'll do me. And as long as I'm not infringing on your inherent rights or property, then you do what you want and I do what I want. And that's the negotiated settlement. And to some degree, when you look at things like the Peace of Westphalia, right, it was this idea that, okay, we keep killing each other over religion, Protestant, Catholicism, things like that. What we're going to do now is we're now going to establish some rules. And that is, within your borders, right, you can set the rules for within your borders, and I'm not going to interfere with your borders. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like what I'm doing in my borders, but what it is it's the realization that we're going to be engaged in constant conflict, warfare, and bloodshed unless we allow for there to be, at least to some degree, geographical areas to where you can be you and we can be us.
Ultimately, the biggest problem with the liberal progressive managerial class and all the institutions that they're running, right? All the NGOs, the WEF, academia, media, arts and entertainment, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, you know, all of them, the federal bureaucracy, I could just keep going, is that they fundamentally just have wrong assumptions about human nature and history and what is the meaning of existence and purpose. Like they genuinely believe that they can eliminate conflict if you just dissolve identity, if you just dissolve borders, if you just dissolve traditional social structures.
But the same token, they cry out diversity is our strength. It's like,
yes, because what they're saying is diversity is our strength, because if you lack diversity, then you're creating boundaries of conflict. So like, for example, historically, there was a very clear distinction between the type of territory that the Germans controlled and the Turks controlled, and the Balkans, right? Between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. There was conflict there, right? They fought, for hundreds of years, they fought wars for control over, Bosnia and Hungary and stuff like that. The Habsburgs fighting against the Ottomans. Now, the liberal project is, we'll just mix the Ottomans and the Austrians together, right? Dissolve the Ottoman Empire, dissolve the Austrian Empire, and have them all live together.
Yeah. And
suddenly you'll have a diversity of people within the Balkans, and they'll get along great. Well, their project is known as Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Which ended in genocide. And by the way, that does not mean that you can't ever, under any circumstances, get people who come from radically different backgrounds coming together. The United States pulled that off to a larger degree. The Roman Empire before us pulled that off to a larger degree. I'm not saying that you can't ever, and I'm using one example of many, right?
Yeah.
I'm using a particular ethnic example, but you can use the same thing for religion. You can use the same thing for culture. You can use the same thing for language.
Well, and let's face it, in Yugoslavia, a lot of the problems were as a result of very, very different religious differences
and cultural differences and ethnic differences and language differences as well. Like, just, they had a lot of issues, right? It wasn't one particular thing. I'm not saying that you can't have a circumstance where different people can come together and live in the same space and get along. But you know what? They can't do that if they don't have any shared underlying principles. If they're complete alien to one another, not just in terms of how they look or how they behave or how they dress or how they act or how they talk or who they worship, but they have not, I mean, those things, I actually think some of those things are necessary. I think I think you do need some unifying purpose. But if you don't have any of that, and you don't have any moral or philosophical foundation, and you're just two completely alien people and you're trying to force them to live together, yes, you're going to create conflict. You're actually, you make it impossible to avoid conflict.
Well,
because before, you could come up with a situation where, the Turks and Austrians fought a lot of wars with each other, but they also signed a lot of peace deals with each other.
Yeah.
And it wasn't 400 years of endless war. But if you force them to live one another and you dissolve these differences and you try to force them to pretend that you can adjudicate those type of differences through parliamentary procedure, right? The Turk wants Sharia law and the Habsburg wants, divine monarchy, Catholic rule, but you say you have to live together and you have to adjudicate your disputes through parliamentary process. Well, you're just going to get a civil war eventually.
Well, and if you look at the component to the extent that diversity can be your strength, it's always because there's some sort of unified purpose and complementary diversity, and that's always been the case.
But the left takes a universalizing take on diversity. They don't say diversity in pursuit of
no. Well, but here's where
X, Y, or Z.
Here's where it's even a slogan just for the left, is that they absolutely believe that there is a unifying purpose, and that unifying purpose is leftism, right? It is to some degree the Marxist interpretation of reality, and because that here's how you know. Is because the moment you get one of the diverse categories that they claim to be the champion of, ethnic minorities, sexual identity, gender, whatever it is, let anybody from one of those categories that has all of the credentials necessary stray from leftist ideology, and they will immediately deem them a traitor and ostracize them. Like I've brought this up before. It is a fascinating reality that in the Virginia General Assembly, a black member of the House of Delegates is not permitted to join the Black Caucus. Not the Black Democrat Caucus. It's not the Black Progressive Caucus. It's not the Black Liberal Caucus.
But
just
that is
the
what
Black
it is, though.
Caucus. And he goes, great, I'm black. I would like to join. You can't. Why? Because you don't sign on to all these ideological objectives of the Black Caucus. It's like, okay, well then what you're using one category of diversity, or one category of one characteristic to categorize or describe your organization. In reality, there's a very, very different characteristic which actually more accurately describes it. How do we know? Because there's non-black members of the Black Caucus, but a black member can't join. So then what are you really? Well, you're a leftist caucus. That's what you are. You just add this additional characteristic. But the moment I don't join the leftism, I no longer get the protection that you're supposed to afford me as a champion of ethnic minorities. And that's how you know they don't even buy the crap they're selling. Everyone understands. This is where we get into the conversation of even the hyper egalitarians
believe in hierarchy.
Yeah. Why? Because it's like gravity, right? It's the same problems I have with a lot of people now as I hear these economic arguments being made that I'm looking at going, this is absurd. Just like supply and demand is an immutable fact dealing with economic policy. You cannot get away from it. So too does hierarchy exist within the created order.
Oh, it always exists. The question is,
what kind of hierarchy? Yeah, how is the hierarchy going to manifest?
Stalin ran a hierarchy.
Well,
despite running a communist state, the CCP claims to be communist, but they're very hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
Like hierarchies always exist. I mean, Robert Michel's one of the individuals that was the one of a handful of leading figures behind elite theory, talks about this in his Iron Law of Oligarchy.
Yeah.
He wrote this book. This is about 100 years ago, maybe even like 120 years ago, very early 1900s. I think before World War I. He wrote this book about politics and political parties, and he basically comes up with this theory that he calls the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which is that any system, any organizational system, by the way, this exists outside of government politics, any form of politics. It could be a HOA.
Yeah.
It's right. It doesn't have to be between states, but any organizational system, does not matter how it's originally set up or intended. It will always devolve into an oligarchy, always, with 100%, success rate or failure rate, depending on your interpretation. And what he's trying to get at is basically the whole hierarchy is inevitable, and you're always going to get a ruling class popping up within that system.
Yeah.
Actually, an example that he brought up is the failure of the socialist movement in Germany before World War I. So the SPD wins all these elections in Germany. They become the largest party in Germany. So therefore, obviously, Germany is going to become a socialist state, right? It's going to become a Marxist state, especially because the SPD in this time period was actually still much more influenced by Marxism than the later versions of the SPD, where they kind of became the enemies of the KPD, the Communist Party. Well, that didn't happen, in large part because the same people that are espousing, all these workers' rights and stuff like that wouldn't bother to show up to the, every Tuesday meeting of the local party chapter to determine, internal affairs within the party. And so the SPD would have huge numbers of members, all these working class, trade union dues paying members of this party. But then the party itself, when they have their meetings, would have 10 people show up.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you have a ruling class within the party that is actually running the party, because the average Joe doesn't even bother. He might be protesting in favor of better working hours or better pay, but he doesn't even bother to show up to the party meeting.
Yeah. Well, we always say in any volunteer organization, and this is true of more than just volunteer organizations, but I think it's especially true there. Usually what you get is 10 to 5% of the people do 90% of the work. And that's not because everybody else is a loser or lazy or whatnot, although sometimes that's true, right? More often than what it is people have a casual or particular reason to associate with the group. It may be for social reasons. It may be to achieve a particular outcome, higher wages, whatever it is. But that's why they're involved. And insofar as the organization is working to achieve those things, they're going to present the level of effort necessary in order to get what they want. Then there's other people that the primary reason they're a part of the organization is because they want to run the organization.
But keep in mind that Michel's is not saying that this is like conspiratorial. He's saying this is a natural, organic process that unfolds.
That's what I'm saying. Is that, again, it wasn't like I'll take political clubs because they're a perfect example of this. Okay, you're a volunteer. You belong to this organization. You care about it, right? You've obviously decided to associate yourself with it, probably for some sort of ideological conviction. And then within that, there were people that will show up to every meeting. There were people that will just get the emails. There were people that will inevitably want to be in charge of it. And again, it's not in and of itself a bad thing. If you didn't have anybody that was willing to actually take charge, then nothing would get done. If everybody wanted to take charge, then nothing would get done. Right? It's more about
a direct democracy.
Exactly, right? It's more about how do you find your place within the system so that you can contribute what is most conducive for you to contribute in order to receive what it is that you want. One of the reasons why the market system, from an economic standpoint, is so powerful is because you engage with it under two criteria. What do I get and what do I got to do to get it? And within a market system, I can now find out based off of my talents, based off of my desires. Not everyone's going to be a billionaire. Is that because the system is rigged against you? Well, if you believe that reality is rigged against you, because chances are most people do not want to put in the time and effort in order to achieve certain things. They want to put in the time and effort necessary to achieve their goals, their objectives. And they may have dreams that far exceed their actual goals, because your goals are what you're willing to work for. Your goals are what you're willing to put in the sufficient effort to achieve, right? Your dreams are just kind of like, wouldn't it be nice? But economic systems allow you to engage to the degree, or free market systems allow you to engage to be able to do that. But again, it always goes toward hierarchy because it's the natural way we interact.
But this carries, I don't think they're unfortunate at all, but for a lot of people, this carries unfortunate implications. Like elite theory is not a democratic way to interpret politics, right? Like Gaetano Mosca, Vilfredo Pareto, Robert Michel's, these are not Democrats. And I mean small d, not the political party. And they weren't liberals. Now, that doesn't mean that they were, the irony is actually Mosca was a huge critic of Mussolini. Gaetano Mosca was a member of the Italian Senate around the time that Mussolini took over, and he was very, very critical of Mussolini because he believed that even though no system could truly be democratic, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a liberal to a degree that he thought that you could get liberal outcomes, and I don't mean this in the modern progressive comprehensive
classical
sense,
liberal outcomes.
but you could get protection of property rights and individual rights, even if you're still using a hierarchical, authoritarian might be too strong of a term, but because again, he was critical of fascism, but he was an espouser of elite theory. He did not think that you could have a true democracy work, that the people could end up ruling.
Neither did our founders.
He basically believed you will always have a ruling class. The question is, what is that ruling class? Who makes up the ruling class? What is their mythos to justify their existence? And how do they govern?
Yeah.
And all of those things, you could have very, very different outcomes depending on each of those inputs.
Yeah.
And when I'm actually about to go full circle here, because when you think about the current system today, there was something that I tweeted that you like quote tweeted earlier today about like the current monetary system.
I know our friend Jeff Younger got mad at it.
Like
even though I don't think he disagrees or you disagree.
No, the funny thing is I agree with what he's saying, but he was like, "You're wrong," and I'm like,
"I don't think you
are."
I
agree with everything you're saying. What do you mean I'm wrong?
Yeah.
But like here's the deal. We have a fiat system, right? Money is printed out of thin air. It's just, there's no gold backing it up, no Bitcoin, no anything. It's just, full faith and credit of the federal government. Okay, great. So money's just printed out of thin air. We have this thing called Bretton Woods. Really, it's Bretton Woods 2.0 because Bretton Woods 1.0 was actually pegged to the gold system, gold standard. But, after 1971, we get rid of the gold standard. And so it's just a global fiat system. It's no longer a global currency system backed up by gold.
Yeah.
So the dollar's still in place, but nothing is propping it up except the federal government saying, trust us, trust me, bro. So what happens is, where does this money go? Because money gets printed. Anytime there's a downturn in the economy, money gets printed. Look at the dot-com bubble, look at the 2008 housing crash, look at 2020 with COVID. Money gets printed, interest rates drop, money printer go burr.
Yeah.
Well, that money goes somewhere. Well, that money usually, with but very rare exceptions, flows into, lo and behold, those that have political access.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that newly printed cash.
This is the Cantillon effect.
This is the Cantillon effect. Disproportionately goes to a small number of people in society, the 1%, the elites. People use phrases for it, but they're actually, they might not understand the system. A lot of these people that talk about this don't actually understand the system. A lot of the economic populists that are railing against this, their critique is actually well-founded, but they don't necessarily have a great solution to it. They're angry, but they don't really know what's happening. This money is being printed and it's funneling into asset prices, basically, right? It's driving home prices up. It drives stock prices up. It creates asset bubbles. You get this thing called the everything bubble where, before it was just, savings and loans crisis in the 80s. And then it was, tech stocks in the early internet period of the 1990s. And then it was the housing market leading up to 2008. And now it's everything. It's everything. In some ways, it's the total state applied to economics. It's no longer just infecting one thing. It's now infected everything. All asset classes are just going up through the roof. And so you have this like giant milkshake of liquidity, to quote Brent Johnson. Brent Johnson's dollar milkshake theory. It's the everything bubble. It's everywhere. You have just trillions of dollars just, frothing around, and that money has to go somewhere. And so it all goes into assets, and it drives the stuff that the rich own up in price. Well, now in some ways you're actually creating a crisis, because how do you justify that system? Because a lot of people over a long enough period of time, they might not be economic experts, right? They might not have read a bunch of monetary theory, but they know they're getting screwed over because they can't afford a house anymore.
Well, and
so you create a perverse incentive for an ideology to justify the ruling class. This goes back into Italian elite theory. You have a ruling class that is benefiting from this, the managerial class, the academics, the bureaucrats, the professors, the money managers on Wall Street, the Hollywood filmmakers, and they all believe the same thing. The newspaper writers of the New York Times. Notice how they all believe the same things? They all espouse wokeism. They all talk about, transgenderism and, using pronouns and Latinx and white guilt and we hate men and men are trash and like all the stuff we've talked about on this podcast. They all believe the same things. Why? What do they have in common with each other? Well, the thing is, they're all espousing an ideology that provides a thin veneer, a moral justification for the current system that they're all benefiting from. Because if you have a financial system that is built around real productivity, real savings, Austrian style, sound money, actual productive growth, I'm talking about manufacturing, I'm talking about, construction, building things, not manipulating numbers on spreadsheets. If that was the system we had, the system that we had before the world wars, the system that we had before Nixon, these people would not be running the entire system. Entrepreneurs would be running the entire system. Factory owners would be running the entire system. Workers would be running the entire system. People that make stuff, that invest in stuff, real stuff, not fake bubbles. They would be the ones that would have the political power and pull. They would be the ruling class. And they, so what happens is, and then I'll send it back to you. What happens is that you create this moral void, and what fills the moral void to kind of justify the system? Wokeism does. Wokeism, if you think about it, serves as the perfect justification to kind of hide what's going on and create a justification. Like think about it from this standpoint. Conservatives espouse fiscal restraint, right? Fiscal conservatism. The right espouses, live within your means. The left espouses justice.
Yeah.
Guess which one a fiat system would prefer?
Yeah. Justice. Because especially when you don't have any real fixed meaning of justice.
Especially when you can take a portion of that printed money and you can funnel it into DEI, into climate initiatives.
Well, I think if I had to sum up kind of like this concept is, so right now what you're seeing is the right is looking at really, really bad trade deals, and they're saying, yes, tariffs, we're going to get it back. That's going to be the source of our wealth and prosperity. The left is looking at the billionaires, it's evil billionaires. And we need a system of greater redistribution. And then you have two types of people that are benefiting from the system as it currently exists. You have some people that are deliberately engaging with and manipulating the system in a particular direction because they understand how it works and they benefit directly from it. And by the way, that's not always the richest people. And two, you have other people that say, okay, well, this is the system. I understand how it works. I didn't create it. I don't necessarily want it. I don't even necessarily like it. But this is the system. So I'm going to work with the system that you give me. And it's kind of like you don't blame somebody in a situation. Like if I'm living under, like for instance, the people that were living under communism, where the only way that you could rise through the ranks was to join the Communist Party. That didn't mean they were a diehard communist. It was just, well, if I don't do this, I get killed, or I literally stunt my entire development as a human being in my life. Well, we kind of have the same system under the current fiat system that we have, where you have this situation where if the government is going to engage in inflationary monetary policy in order to prop up the international monetary system that we're a part of, well, then you start to learn, okay, well, then how do I get wealthy, or how do I operate within an inflationary system? And one of the key components there is, well, you invest in assets. You invest in assets that increase in value, and value is a tenuous word that we're using right now, but they increase in the amount of Federal Reserve notes that they can command within the economy as inflation goes up. Well, if you're wealthy, you're clearly you're not going to put all your money into, US dollars. You're going to put it into assets that are making money. And so the impact there is, okay, well, now if I'm somebody that doesn't have assets, but I would like to get them, but I'm living on a fixed wage or whatnot, well, my individual dollar that I can use to buy things or invest is increasingly commanding less within the economy. And so you see this big gap between like real wages and like the rich 1% or whatnot.
It becomes a K-shaped economy.
Yeah, so you have this going up here and you have this remaining flat, and people are looking at that going, well, that's unfair.
It is unfair.
It is. But then what they're doing is
missing why it's happening.
Let me finish. So if the guy's up here, you're looking at going, that's unfair. You must be responsible for manipulating this system. And now if you are successful, that is now an indication of your corruption, right? Because I'm working hard and yet the system's not working for me. And what I think people need to understand, like what I had to go through this process of understanding is that somebody having a lot of money does not make them my enemy. Somebody attempting to prop up a manipulative system, which puts the government in the position, or the Federal Reserve in the position, of ultimately picking winners and losers, that's my enemy. Now understand something. some of the people benefiting from this current system are not the billionaires. Some of them are, but the other people benefiting from this system are the ones that are getting constant government subsidization for whatever their little pet project is, and that might be sitting at a university, right?
It's the managerial
teaching
class.
Marxism. It might be it might be the bureaucrat, it might be the mid-level bureaucrat within a government program whose job would never exist if it was actually based upon what they produce in the economy. And so, yes, the person that is working hard and actually producing something of value is understandably angry about the system that is putting them at an economic disadvantage to the person that creates no economic value, but has placed themselves within the industry that benefits from inflationary monetary policy.
Do you
I have
get
2 questions from the chat, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. One of them said, Nick or Tina, could you get Christian to tie in how economic, foreign, and domestic policies modeled in Victoria 3 reflect reality? It would be hilarious if we could get him to tie this into his favorite game. And then there is a second question, so answer that, and then I'll ask.
I asked the second question first.
No, you answer that.
So, oh my gosh. There's a lot actually wrong with Victoria 3. Like all Paradox games, they come out with a game and they don't actually finish it until 2 years after they release it. But honestly, the biggest problem is they treat people as interchangeable parts.
Yeah.
Right? Because it makes sense because you need to run a simulation. So, their numbers on spreadsheets. Like as long as you pass the right laws. And what's funny is in some ways, Victoria 3 encourages you to have an open borders society because then you can like the way you min-max is say like you unify Germany, right? Well, eventually you run out of population to work, once you industrialize and you build all the factories and everything, you run out of people to staff it. So you're like, I need more people. So then you pass open borders laws and then you colonize Africa and then you import like the Zulu into Berlin in order to work in the coal mines or something like that. And it just doesn't really work because it doesn't factor in like cultural cohesion, right? Like, again, this is the problem we're going through right now. When you dissolve any borders and you say people are interchangeable parts. Well, no, everybody is unique and everybody, again, belongs to a particular time and place because of who they are and their upbringing. I'm not just a number on a spreadsheet. You might be able to model me in a video game like a number on a spreadsheet, but I can guarantee you this. If you plopped me in 1890s Berlin, I would not fit in.
Yeah.
Even though I have a German last name, I wouldn't fit in at all. And so, and the other problem too is that they have a, their monetary system is, pounds, but nobody issues it. It's just kind of like the in-game currency. So like they're doing their best, and I think it's fun, but it doesn't take into the human aspect, which you can't because it's a simulation. So I'm not saying that it gets full
can I
blame
say
for
this?
that,
What's fascinating about simulation games, right? Like I like Civ. I like Civ 6, Civ 7. I just got Civ 7. All of them, like it's interesting.
It encourages central planning.
It encourages central planning, and what you will end up seeing is that, like for instance, if you adopt a particular government, they will give you certain advantages for adopting that government. So, for instance, if you adopt communism and like Civ 5 or Civ 6 or whatnot, you actually get agricultural boosts, which is absurd because
it doesn't reflect reality.
No, they dealt with huge famines. So what are they doing? They're actually. So if you're a game player, right, and you don't really understand economics or you don't really understand a great deal about world history, but you're playing this game, and you start to formulate these assumptions about reality based off of what the gameplay tells you happens once you adopt certain things. So it's like, oh, I'm going to adopt communism because that gives me better agricultural output. That's never been true in world history. So why is it true in the game? Because Marxism claims that that's what it would do. And so you have this idea where it's in this theoretical simulation where they don't have to take into account the individual desires, dreams, or motivations, passions, faults, capabilities, because they're all just interchangeable parts within a spreadsheet.
And honestly, this is why Minecraft's better, is because as long as you keep the villagers happy and you give them the right environment, you can enslave them as much as you want to produce everything you want.
Well, but no, there's an important lesson here, because a lot of your modern economists, if you ask them why they think certain things will work a certain way, it's based off of simulations. What makes the Austrian school? This is actually one of my problems with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman still, he wasn't like, I respect a great deal about Milton Friedman. There's no question that he advocated for larger free markets, but I tend to disagree with him on certain things with respect to monetary policy and with respect to how he applied his economic experience to just human interactions, because I think there was some mistakes that he made where he was applying economic factors to cultural conditions. And if you look at the Austrian school, one of the things that I really respect about the Austrian school of economics is they focus so much on the idea of deductive reasoning. And you would think this would be obvious, but you would be fascinated. I got in an argument with an economist that used to serve in the House of Delegates, and she was like, well, when the data doesn't say that, you don't just throw out the data. It's like, the data sets you're using are incredibly limited and based off of limited data sets. And when your data produces a result which violates certain basic fundamental principles of reality, you say, well, that's what the data says. And I'm looking at you going, I don't care how much data you use, demand curves slope downward, right? So what does that mean? It means the more expensive something gets, typically speaking, the less demand there is for it, either because you don't value it to the degree to which the cost is increased, or because you just can't afford it, or whatever it is. So the demand goes down as the price goes up. And she was sitting here trying to argue that, well, no, with minimum wage increases, that's different if you factor this, and if you no, this is deductive reasoning. Right? You have to have certain rules that just apply within reality. And if the data overthrows the general rule, then one of two things can be true. Either the general rule was based upon false premises, or your data isn't sufficient. And
I have the second question if you guys would like.
Yes.
Anyway.
Nick's going to filibuster
Sorry.
for the rest of the podcast unless you ask it.
Okay, so Erica Ray says, so now what? Economically, how do we responsibly move forward given all of the factors you've highlighted?
Okay, so here's the part where I'm going to say something very heretical and Nick's going to hate me.
Hate you.
Yeah, well, okay, hate is too strong of a word. I don't know if this is going to be sufficient to break the system. And if you allow me to explain why we need to break the system, I can. But I can see an argument in favor of Trump's tariffs that I've heard nobody else advocate, which is that Trump's tariffs are going to break the system, and we actually want the system to be broken because the system is a fiat system that is benefiting.
Specific. Wait a second.
Because you've got
wait
the
1 second. We need to
market
clarify.
tanking, and when the market tanks, it kind of has an effect of turning over the people that are investing.
That's true.
It's kind of funny because the same people that are flipping out over the market tanking are the same ones that used to go and protest the 2% or whatever, or the highest 1% or whatever. They protested the markets. They wanted them down, but now they don't. Well,
again, that's just because the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. But
That's
Christian, I want you to narrow something down here a little bit as far as scope, because when we say break the system, that means 10 different things to 10 different people listening. When you're talking about breaking the system, you are actually talking about the monetary system,
the fiat dollar system.
Okay, so when you say we need to break that system and Trump's tariffs, because essentially what it interrupts is this idea of the United States dollar being the reserve currency, which means other countries all over the world, in order to engage in effective international trade, need US dollars, which means we need to print them, and it ends up creating the incentive where we export our manufacturing overseas so we can send them dollars in exchange for goods.
Yes.
So explain how the tariffs break that system. And even though you and I are not big fans of tariffs conceptually, why it could be beneficial.
Yeah. So listen to this and give me your thoughts. I wrote this last night at like 4 a.m., which might be why I'm I'm pretty tired today. But I said this. The global American empire, which is what it is, that we all live under, is built on the dollar status as the global reserve currency. It's what finances our current oikophobic ruling class, inflates asset bubbles that disproportionately benefit this self-hating elite, and keeps the rest of the population sedated with cheap credit and cheap consumer goods, all while offshoring our jobs, flooding our country with migrants, and dissolving our nation's identity. America had to kill its own middle class to keep the dollar in this position. It had to deindustrialize, financialize, and dismantle what used to be a cohesive national identity in order to replace it with a globalist one managed by bureaucrats and propped up by an ideology which demonizes the very people who built this country. And the truth is, this empire can't be reformed. This was the mistake so many Republicans have made for the last 45 years. It can only be maintained or destroyed. To preserve it is to accept national decay. To dismantle it is to endure short-term pain, but to finally reclaim so many of the things we've lost over the last 80 years, like honest work, rooted communities, and the right to live in a nation that remembers who it is. The system won't collapse overnight. I don't know if tariffs themselves are going to fully dismantle the global American empire, but I do know this. You can either keep the empire or save the republic, but you cannot do both. Now, that was a bit philosophical, but if you want to get technical, what I was trying to articulate and what I think this whole conversation was kind of leading up to, and maybe one day we need to do like a more in-depth approach on this in particular, is that we have this fiat system. All this money gets printed. This money inevitably goes to a small number of people. That's called the Cantillon effect. Those people are disproportionately represented by what we call the managerial class. These are your bureaucrats. These are the type of people that increasingly make up the Democratic Party's coalition.
The WEF membership.
The WEF types.
Yeah.
And so what also happens is because of all of this, you get a ton of negative side effects. Deindustrialization, factories shutting down, jobs going overseas, people falling behind, a K-shaped economy where you have not normal income inequality from human interactions, human choices, but artificial income inequality from ever-growing asset bubbles, the everything bubble. Because this money finds its way into asset prices that this wealthy, politically connected, progressive elite that doesn't even view themselves as Americans, they view themselves as tourists in their own country, own these assets. And so what happens is that middle America pays a huge price for this. But the managerial class, the progressive elites, they benefit from this. And so how do they keep that system in place? Because they're the ruling class. If you're going full Italian elite theory, they're the ones running the country. So what's their mythos? What do they use to justify their elite? Because all ruling elites justify their existence one way or another. They justify it through wokeism. They justify it through progressivism, social justice. We're going to take this money and put it into ESG. We're going to take this money and put it into climate initiatives. We're going to take it and put it into reparations or DEI or diversity initiatives, affirmative action. We're going to remake society in a progressive liberal image. And we're going to target all the evils in society, because the reason that there's all this inequality, it's not because of money printing, it's because of white supremacy. It's because of toxic masculinity. It's because of patriarchy. That's what's driving all this stuff.
Yeah, greed.
Actually, it's the Federal Reserve's money printer giving you a bunch of money is what's driving it all. But you can't say that, because then the next question is going to be, why the hell should you have the money? And so what you come up with is a justification for the current system where you're the perpetuator of the injustice, but you're also the savior. And so what inevitably happens, like always, is that the progressives are arsonists masquerading as the fire brigade. And so wokeism inevitably becomes that moral justification to keep the very system going that creates wokeism in the first place, that creates the inequality in the first place, that fuels the managerial class's existence. Because all these institutions, all the NGOs, the universities, the financial apparatuses, the federal bureaucracy, all of these things would not exist in a sound money system. To some degree, they would exist. Insofar as you would have some government, you would have some bureaucracy, but it would be tiny. Look at the size of the federal bureaucracy in the 1880s versus today. You had some bureaucracy, but it was minuscule compared to today. And so where I'm trying to go with this is that you have a system that must be broken if you're on the right. Because that system is what's driving what we call wokeism. The Great Awakening is funded by money printing. The money printer is it's not just printing dollars, it's printing progressivism. It's astroturfed. The ideology exists in order to create a moral justification for the current twisted monetary system that is distorting the entire economy and allowing progressive elites to run everything. And so you break that system and you win the culture wars. How do you break that system? This is where the dollar milkshake comes into play. You choke off the supply of dollars to the rest of the world and you force a financial showdown that we all know is coming at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But if you force it right now, when we're in charge of everything, and you crash the entire system, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if you forced that showdown right now,
Mm-hmm.
and you destroy basically the global fiat system, everybody would suffer. But you know who would suffer the most is the managerial class, the
Mm-hmm.
progressive elites. And if you replace it with a sound money system,
Mm-hmm.
we win. We would
Yeah.
win. We would win the culture wars almost overnight if that happened. Now, I don't know if Trump is having a 47D chess play, 90,000 IQ gigabrain moment here.
Yeah.
He might just be saying tariffs good, reindustrialization good. I'm gonna impose it. But the second and third order effects of what he's doing is he is inadvertently, maybe he's intentionally doing this, but he is basically putting into place policies that will choke off the supply of dollars to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world gets their dollars by trading with us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we make that trade artificially more expensive, we are limiting the supply of dollars. And as the dollar milkshake theory espouses, a restriction on the supply of dollars is going to create a global liquidity crisis that would trigger all of this.
Yeah. Okay. So
sorry,
I think
that was long to explain.
No. But it was good. And I think the problem we have right now too is I think we got a desync between our audio and our video. Something happened. We had a little hiccup there. So we'll see if we can't fix that for you. But let me, Erica Ray asks, like, okay, so what are the action statements here? What are the action items? So again, I think what Christian just articulated is actually a really good summary of, how this system works and how the progressive element has actually worked themselves into the system to be able to benefit from the way it exists. Because what we found, and the reason why the left is so furious right now in the United States, is because every time Doge uncovers one of these like massive expenditures from U.S. aid or whatnot, what is one of the unifying components of all of it? It's all going to fund some sort of liberal progressive ideology. And that liberal progressive ideology actually uplifts the current system that we have. Now, I would say this, there's a ton of other reasons why that system exists that are not necessarily because of liberal progressivism. Some of it was just out of what was perceived to be practical necessity at the time, right? Like Nixon didn't just take us off the gold standard in the early 70s because he felt like it. There really was a crisis point, and a lot of the decisions that were made were fueled by decisions that made good political sense in the moment, but were not ultimately good long-term decisions. But again, when you have a 2, 4, or 6 year election cycle, what you get is political decisions that are in service to 2, 4, and 6 year election cycles. And so that's actually part of the larger critique too with the way that our republic is organized, is that does that actually foster too much emphasis on the immediate as opposed to the long term? So to your answer, here's the action items. First and foremost, like what Doge is doing is actually really important because it has, for the first time, I think, exposed to the general population the absolute massive amount of fraud, waste, and abuse, not to mention just errors that are made not because of any sort of nefarious purpose, but just because of incompetence. So why is highlighting that so important? Because people are like, I want action. Okay, good. But the problem is that before this, we didn't have nearly as many people demanding action about these sorts of things. So a lot of it is just exposure to people about how it actually works. So once you understand how it works and where the problems are, then people start to assign the necessary hostility toward the organizations or the institutions that deserve the hostility. The federal bureaucracy deserves the hostility. Inflationary monetary policy deserves the hostility. The Federal Reserve deserves the hostility. You know what doesn't? Free markets. Free trade doesn't deserve the hostility when you actually understand what just free trade is. Now, bad trade deals absolutely deserve the hostility. So part of it is proper diagnosis of the issues. Now, I'm going to say this. I've said it 1,000 times, gets me in trouble every time with a certain sector of the audience. Do you think a government-run school, which is absolutely dependent upon these systems, are teaching kids that this is a major part of the problem? Of course not. Of course not. And if you don't have it in a representative system, if you don't have an electorate that understands, hey, this is what's causing a lot of our problems, then they're never going to actually elect people that are interested in fundamentally changing those issues or systems. And so it's not that we need to completely get rid of the republic or completely get rid of the Constitution or completely just upend the federal system. But we do need to recognize that the monetary systems that were put in place, regardless of what other reasons or justifications would be, have now created an incredibly perverse incentive structure. But whenever you have people that have understood the perverse incentive structure and will utilize it in their favor, you find people that will protect it. And so a part of what this is getting more and more people to understand the nature of the problem. And then what you do is you elect people that are actually addressing those particular issues. And so on the election standpoint, like right now, we have put so much effort into Doge Watch, which, by the way, if you haven't gone over and watched Doge Watch or Doge Talks, please do, because there's a reason why we have invested so much time and effort into producing these. It's because one of the things that we did in our last Doge Talks with Senator Mark Wayne Mullen is he was talking about the continuing resolution. Well, what is the continuing resolution from 2025 full of? A bunch of Joe Biden spending. All this crap that Doge just identified, all right, Congress, the one we just elected, have actually just reauthorized it. Why? Why would you do that? Well, then all of a sudden we find out that, well, Trump said to reauthorize it. Leadership said to reauthorize. Why? Well, because what they wanted was to basically get through this continuing resolution so they didn't shut down the government, and because they knew they could get Senate Democrats to go along with the current continuing resolution. Because if their argument is, you don't have to accept this, but this is their argument. If you don't allow this continuing resolution to go through, they can filibuster it, and now you have a government shutdown, and now we run into an issue where Doge has to stop what it's doing. What the Trump administration said was, if you allow this to go through and you authorize this spending, we will identify the spending through Doge and we'll sequester it. We'll hold it up. We won't allow it to actually go out. We'll keep it within that agency. Then what the Senate can do, what the House can do, is they can do what they call rescission bills, which is pull back the spending in the budget. The difference is the Senate can't filibuster a rescission bill, straight up or down. So what we should all be watching for right now is, are they doing rescission bills? Because they authorize all this bad spending, but that's the mechanism to take it back. Are they doing it? The other thing they've said is the next continuing resolution, that's when you'll see all the cuts recommended from Doge in a new budget. Okay, when do those budget amendments have to be out in order to make the next one? They have to be out by July 31st. Otherwise, there's never going to be enough time to actually get a clean resolution in September. So when I give you action items, part of the reason of what we're talking about and exposing people to what actually happens so they can understand it, it's because we're trying to get people to understand that this is a very complex process. But we actually have mechanisms in place that are starting to address it on a more fundamental level. And it's, again, the tariffs might end up inadvertently. I don't think he's doing the tariffs to break the system, but the tariffs might inevitably break that system. But the other thing that you do to break it is you actually reduce the massive power of the federal government and the bureaucracy, because they're one of the chief people pushing the inflationary spending. And they're not just pushing inflationary spending because of the random growth of government. They're pushing it because they're utilizing it to push left-wing ideology, which then works back into the feed loop to protect the inflationary spending. And so the structural changes that are going on right now are actually pretty critical. That's why I say we are living in a decisive moment of U.S. history. And if we actually get drastic reductions of the federal bureaucracy, you're going to see two things right off the bat. You're going to see the elimination of the justification for federal spending at the current rates that it exists. And the other thing that you're going to start to see overnight is all of a sudden, all of these crazy ideas that you see infiltrating within your university system, Hollywood, ESG, DEI, all of it, all of a sudden it starts to significantly shrink overnight. Why? Because of what Christian said. It's AstroTurf. They have to either confiscate your money to do it, or they have to print money to justify it. Well, the government can stop the money printing, and the government can stop the confiscation of your wealth in order to do it. And now they're attempting to. The biggest question that we have over the next several months is, will the Senate, will the House actually do the rescission bills? Will Congress actually pass the continuing resolution bills? And what will be the impact of the tariffs? Because I will tell you right now, it will cause prices to go up. Anybody that is telling you that we're just going to pass a bunch of tariffs and it's not going to have any impact on prices don't understand how prices work. Because even if you do think it's going to lead to a resurgence of American manufacturing, that doesn't happen overnight. Not to mention the fact that there is still a ton of rules, regulations, and laws in place that Congress has to address to actually make American manufacturing more competitive. There's no getting around that. So that's where we're essentially at right now. I think the next 2 years are decisive, because if we get through this Trump administration and we haven't seen significant changes and Democrats actually take back the House or the Senate, or we find ourselves in a situation where they can stop everything through the legislative process, one of two things is going to happen within our lifetimes. One of two things. You are either going to get a Republican administration, which then says, fine, we have to break the system more, in which case you're going to see things like filibuster go away. No more filibuster. Or you're going to see things like deliberate, you're going to see the thing that the left keeps saying is a constitutional crisis right now that isn't, you're going to see it actually become one, because you're going to see the courts passing decisions, and you're going to see an administration that says, I now recognize your decision and I'm no longer listening to it, and I'm just doing what I want. And we'll let the electorate decide who they like more. We'll let the electorate decide which decision they like more, the one I made or the one the judiciary made, right? You will start to see that. If you don't get that, if the system is allowed to limp along the way it currently does, then eventually what you're going to get is just a sovereign debt crisis. And that's where you get genuine chaos, because at that point, you can't pay the police, you can't pay the military, you can't pay, like, no more Social Security checks are going out. Or I take it back. The Social Security checks go out, you just can't buy anything with it because it's worthless. Right? And then you get revolution, like violent revolution. So these are the things that I see happening over the next couple of years. Like the next couple of years, if we can get some really good substantive things done and people actually come to the right conclusions with respect to diagnosing the problems and identifying the right solutions, this will be a decisive point that could really be beneficial for the United States. The one thing that I think everybody needs to understand, and I think Christian will agree with this, you do not get out of close to a century of bad policy and 50 years of inflationary monetary policy without pain. That's going to happen. The pain has to come in order to correct. Now, to Christian's point, where the pain is going to be felt the most in a lot of these cases is actually in the managerial class. And in essence, it can start to happen in the places where the pain should happen, but it will impact everybody. There's no question on that. And part of being prepared for that is understanding what it looks like, how it comes, and realizing that at the end of the day, having genuine capabilities is often what allows you to be able to sustain yourself through difficult economic times. So anyways, I hope that answers some of the question. I think we had one more, and then we got to kind of sign off here. I'm going to give Christian the last word today because it is his birthday. But one question was, can the income earned on tariffs be used however the executive wants, or is there legislative power blocking that? If I understand, the way that income comes in from tariffs, and Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, is it just goes into the overall budget. It ends up becoming a revenue stream into the budget, and then Congress is the one that's ultimately responsible for allocating the money. It starts in the House with the Senate concurring and the president signing off on a budget, and then that's how that money gets distributed. But to my knowledge, we don't have a mechanism where money just revenue. We don't have
like a
in.
special fund.
Yeah, revenue typically is just come into the Treasury, and the president can use it however they want. Now, you can set up special funds that, like, we have the governor has an investment fund in Virginia and whatnot, but even that ends up being a really perverse system where now the chief executive has the ability to essentially pick winners and losers in the economy on how they're going to spend it and whatnot. So I hope that answers that question. Christian, take us home with your final thoughts on the nature of the problem and potential. I mean, you've already explained the nature of the problem. What do you see as far as predictions or however else you would like to end it? It's your birthday, man. Go for it.
I would just say that fiat currency makes fiat morality inevitable. If it's the following things are always true in all times and all places. There's always a ruling class that's in charge. That ruling class always has a justification for why they're in charge, a founding mythos, and that justification is usually a moral justification. And look, if it's divorced from a higher purpose, I would argue a divinely inspired purpose, like our current ruling class most certainly is, then they have to kind of invent their own justification. And their justification is what we call wokeism. wokeism cannot exist in a sound money system. It can't, because the institutions that promote wokeism are dependent on a fiat system funding them. They would not exist otherwise. The NGO complex, the sprawling federal bureaucracy, the administrative state, the universities, media and academia, Hollywood, Wall Street, most of these things don't actually produce anything of real value of their own. Now, some degree of them will still exist after you get back to a sound money system. It's not like you're going to have no federal bureaucracy, no government, no arts and entertainment, no academia. Those things all existed in the 19th century, early 20th century, but they're not going to have nearly the power and scope that they have today if we get rid of the fiat system. And so I think the kind of grand unifying theory on all of this is that, look, if you want to win the culture wars, if you want to save the country, if you want to defeat wokeism and progressivism, you need to go back to a sound money system. And anything that gets us there, I'm in favor of. And so I don't support tariffs because I hate free trade. I think Bastiat's actually right on the idea of tariffs. But insofar as tariffs might accelerate the destruction of the current monetary system that we have, I'm at least willing to entertain that idea. I don't know if they're going to do the job. I think that there's a very good argument to be made that they're not going to do the job. But I think that as conservatives or as people on the right, we need to be looking at ways to accelerate the destruction of the fiat system and restore sound money in this country, because fixing that solves all the other political problems that we've talked about on this podcast. Maybe not all the social problems, but a lot of the political problems.
All right. We'll leave it at that. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found this entertaining. Christian, happy birthday. And again, ladies out there, we gave you some important tips on if you're looking to bake Christian a cake in the future, stay away from chocolate. Lemon or strawberry. Good to know. Once again, thank you all very much for joining us. Consider joining our intentional community, the IC as we like to call it. We'll put the notes for that into the show notes, the link for that into the show notes. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.